I'm Annie Duke. In our last lesson, we explained the difference between big draws and small draws after the flop. Now we're going to take a closer look at what it is that makes a big draw and give you some advice that can help you make the most of these kinds of big hands. In our last lesson, we defined a big draw as a hand that, while you don't actually have as good as a pair yet, has so many outs that you usually have the mathematical advantage on your opponent with 2 cards left to come. But that's not really the whole story. Let's go back to our example hand where we held ace of spades, king of spades on a board of 10 of spades, 6 of spades, deuce of hearts. And this time we'll be against just one opponent who's holding a pair of queens. Now there are 3 factors to consider that really make this hand a big draw as opposed to a small one. The first is, along with the flush draw, we also have overcards that give us 6 extra outs. We're against only one opponent, and we still have 2 cards left to come. Now, the 2 really important factors to notice here is that we are against only one opponent with 2 cards to come. And it's because of this that our hand is really currently a mathematical favorite over a hand like queens, and is actually just slightly worse than even money against a hand like king-king. If we add another opponent to the mix, or if we give ourselves only 1 card left to come, then our odds aren't nearly as good. In fact, we become a dog. If our hand doesn't improve on the turn, we'll go from being a favorite to being about a 2.5 to 1 underdog to win on the river, since our 15 outs are only going to be likely to hit 30% of the time. Similarly, we no longer have a big draw if we're facing more than one opponent in this hand, because our chances of winning the hand by hitting either an ace or a king are just much less. In this case, where we're facing more than one opponent, we really need to discount those 6 extra outs that we would really count if we were heads up, because we have to look at the hand as just as if we're really only holding the nut flush draw. It's against multiple opponents. If we hit an ace or a king, it may not be good. So against more than one opponent, we go from being a mathematical favorite on the flop to being a 2 to 1 underdog with 2 cards left to come, because all you have now is a flush draw, which is a 2 to 1 underdog in that spot. And worse yet, you're a 4 to 1 underdog with just 1 card left to fall. Now that we really understand that it's so important to be against one opponent with 2 cards to come, we can logically set our goals with this hand, our strategies. Since our hand goes from being a favorite on the flop to being a dog on the turn if we should miss one of our 15 outs, our goal should really be to play the hand very fast on the flop, because this will ensure that we either win the pot right there, which is totally fine since all we have is ace high at that moment, or that we'll definitely get to see 2 cards, which is really what makes our hand a favorite in the first place. By betting big on the flop, we may induce our opponent to fold, which lets us win the pot right there. Betting big can also cause your opponent to call or raise all in, which is also fine since then there's no more betting. And if they call but aren't all in, there's a very good chance your opponent will check the turn, which means that you can check and get a free card and make sure that you get to see those 2 cards that you need. If your opponent bets into you on the flop, regardless of which one of you was the pre-flop raiser, you don't care if you raised before the flop or they did, they bet into you, you shouldn't hesitate to make a big raise with your big draw, since you really don't want to make any more decisions with this hand. Raising your draw here has the added benefit of looking very deceptive, because you would make exactly the same play if you had flopped a set on this kind of highly textured board. If your opponent folds to your raise, that's great. You have ace high. You're happy to win. But if he calls, either he's calling all in and you'll definitely get to see 2 cards, which is what you want, or if he's not calling all in, he'll almost definitely check the turn to you, which is also a good thing, because then you could choose to take that free card. If you've moved all in and he calls, you're still going to see 2 cards, which is the best outcome for you with this hand. And if he re-raises you all in, you'll almost always be getting the right price to call, even if your hand is downgraded to just a flush, because you'll get to see those 2 cards. If you were the pre-flop raiser and your opponent checks the flop, you should definitely be betting your hand there. If you get check raised, you don't really care, since your hand is so strong that you'll probably want to re-raise. If your opponent calls, he'll probably check the turn to you, and you can decide whether to bet if you hit or check if you didn't, or take a bluff at it. If your opponent raised pre-flop and then checks the flop to you, This is where I want you to be very careful, since most players continuation bet this spot when they're heads up. This play usually signifies that your opponent has either complete air, which you're beating anyway, so it doesn't matter to check there, or has a complete monster hand like a set, and your hand is no longer going to be the favorite to win. In either case, there's really no reason for you to bet. Instead, check behind your opponent and just take the free card to try to hit and punish him for trying to be so tricky. In short, your goal with a big draw is to get your money in on the flop unless you're really suspicious of your opponent's hand, in which case you want to definitely try and see a free card.